Marx's revolutionary East was articulated long before Leninist and Maoist theories and practices remains underappreciated in the Marxist literature. Marx is still largely held responsible, right or wrong, for the theory that ties socialist revolution to the industrialized nations. But neither Leninist nor Maoist revolutions betrayed or negated Marx, who had been there ahead of history to convert Oriental hindrances to stimuli. Okay, three, beyond unilinear and versus multilinear development. I won't say anything here, but I just say the point is not about unilinear or multilinear, but about not making capitalism as a teleology. So there is an inevitable end of capitalism. And in that sense, we need to make a distinction between two notions, pre-capitalism and non-capitalism. Four, uneven and combined development, I will skip it. And five, the revolutions, I originally wanted to say a word about Lenin, but I'll skip it. So finally, Asia's methodological function in Marx. The Asian experiences and potential in a comparative perspective served Marx an eloquent arena and pathway that allowed the monumental test of his hope for the viability of communal rejuvenation in a modern socialized production. And this test remains inclusive. I think I'll stop here. Okay.
Okay, in the interest of time, we'll have to forego the questions, but if I might make so bold, and on behalf of those who have participated in the conference, I want to thank one more time the organizers of this wonderful conference. The conference has been marked by both intelligence and kindness. We wish also to thank those members of the hotel staff who worked so hard to make our stay here pleasant. Very briefly, please join me in thanking not only Professor Lin for her lovely lecture, but also Audrey one more time for this brilliant conference.
Thank you, Professor Jensen, for those kind words. And I would really like to thank our speaker for agreeing to take the questions later at that institution. He's an officer of the Order of Canada, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and honorary fellow of the Canadian Economics Association. Professor Hollander, can I now request you to address our participants?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for their thoughtful consideration with me to attend this important conference at a distance. Domestic circumstances made it impossible for me to be present. Details of my talk are included in a printed version dated the 20th of June. That's today. Earlier versions that may be floating around are already outdated, and I'd be happy to send a copy of the printed version which contains the details of any of the statements that remain assertive, as they must be in a lecture. I have a particular point to make regarding my special right to give a talk on Marx, and that is that I'm related to Karl Marx. There's a mid-17th century connection, so it's all in the family. Let me start by making the point regarding the term revolution. The term revolution suggests violent overturn, and the view of Karl Marx as revolutionary is not only standard textbook fare filtering through to popular opinion, but also often found in authoritative professional accounts, as by Isaiah Berlin, who unconditionally asserted that Marx was all his life a convinced and uncompromising believer in a violent working class revolution. Some formulations don't specify that violence is intended by the attribution to Marx, but such a reading is invited. Thus, according to a very recent contributor to the New York Review of Books, he writes, with the rise of totalitarian fascism in the 1930s, the Frankfurt School lost confidence in the ability of workers to mount a revolution against monopoly capitalism and the state sustaining it, as Marx predicted they would. It regarded workers as paralyzed by conformist tendencies and unable to discern the source of their grievances in the capitalist system. Of particular interest is a reference by Eric Hobsbawm to the actual revolution in the sense of the presumably violent transfer of power, which would in turn initiate a lengthy process of post-revolutionary transition. John Stuart Mill specialists of the first rank frequently focus on a contrast between their subject and Marx. Thus, Robson affirms that Mill objects strenuously to the idea of violent revolution, and Persky, in his recent book of 2016, says where Marx saw revolution and planning, Mill saw reform and cooperation, and outlined a coherent evolutionary path for radical reform. Now, needless to say, the secondary literature yields conflicting opinions, including a focus on Marx's evolutionism. Thus, Joseph Schumpeter, in his celebrated History of Economic Analysis, refers to the grand vision of an imminent evolution of the economic process, that working somehow through accumulation somehow destroys the economy as well as the society of competitive capitalism, and somehow produces an untenable social situation that will somehow give birth to another type of social organization. That's 4 somehows in 4 lines. This, he finds, constitutes Marx's claim to greatness as an economic analyst. Yet when discussing Darwin, Schumpeter makes no mention of Marx's own description of Capital as demonstrating in the social context the same gradual process of evolution that Darwin demonstrated in natural history. Stedman Jones, in his splendid new study of Marx, attributes a methodological parallel with Darwinism, specifically to Engels, not Marx. Now, returning to the main issue, evolution or evolution, Bober makes the valid point that we are obliged to turn to direct evidence in Marx's utterances, since the dialectic cannot inform us whether the future social synthesis will be achieved by a revolutionary cataclysm or by a peaceful transition. A great deficiency indeed. In any event, he finds that up to the early 1850s, it seems that Marx and Engels put great stress on violence, almost giving the impression of relishing it, while from the 1860s on, they begin to allow that at least in certain countries, a peaceful method, the ballot, may be both available and preferable. I shall have this reading in mind as my argument proceeds. Now, the perspective on Marx as revolutionary in the violent sense I find unconvincing, and I shall review the evidence for this conclusion. The repeated use of somehow by Schumpeter in singing the praises of Marx as evolutionist certainly suggests the need to tighten up this side of the argument. I shall maintain that while Marx was no less evolutionary than Mill, his version of evolution, insofar as it relates to prominent features of advanced capitalism, implies a powerful laissez-faire bias in 2 senses: a concern lest reformist measures to correct perceived injustices in the going system assure its permanence, halting the allegedly necessitarian process of transmutation in its tracks, and a warning against premature action to transform systems. Now, much of this is doubtless well known, but it ought to have sufficed to render inappropriate the designation revolutionary. Conservative would be a far more accurate designation. Less well known and strongly reinforcing his laissez-faire reasoning is Marx's sophisticated appreciation of the operation of the free market pricing system. This I shall demonstrate. I then carry the story further with an eye to Marx's evolutionism beyond developments within advanced capitalism. There is the proletarian takeover, which might for Marx occur by way of democratic voting, enabled by extensions of the franchise accorded by the capitalist state in response to pressures generated by capitalist development. Here I take issue with Hobsbawm, who attributes this allegedly revisionist abandoning of the old insurrectionary perspective to Engels alone, and late in the day, in his 1895 introduction to Marx's The Class Struggles in France. And thirdly, there is the stage following a proletarian political takeover, which includes allowance for a residual capitalist sector in the first post-capitalist stage, allowance for income inequality, and even for compensation of expropriated property owners. So let me turn to the threefold evolutionary theme. First of all, evolutionary processes within capitalism. As I've intimated, Marx represents capital as demonstrating that present society, economically considered, is pregnant with a new higher form, showing in the social context the same gradual process of evolution that Darwin demonstrated in natural history. I turn then to the specific processes envisaged at play within capitalism, setting the stage for a transition to communism. Observations in Capital, Volume 3, composed probably in the 1860s, that's before the publication of the first volume, relate to the joint stock company, the ultimate development of capitalist production, as a transitional form from private to social organization. The capital, which in itself rests on a social mode of production, he writes, and presupposes a social concentration of means of production and labor power, is here is here directly endowed with a form of social capital, that is, capital of directly associated individuals, as distinct from private capital, and its undertakings assume the form of social undertakings, as distinct from private undertakings. It is the abolition of capital as private property within the framework of the capitalist mode of production. An earlier comment refers to share capital as the most perfected form, turning into communism together with all its contradictions. The part played by credit is much emphasized, and also with respect to the growth of cooperatives. And the formulation in question is one of the best I know of Marx's evolutionary orientation, confirming his own designation of capital as Darwinian. His case is far greater than Schumpeter had made out. Marx also refers to the growth of monopoly, which requires state interference, a theme expanded by Engels with an eye to prospective nationalization of industry. I should briefly note here the so-called Russian option, sometimes attributed to Marx, entailing the transition to communism based upon the peasant commune rather than upon capitalist development. If taken seriously, this alternative would undermine the entire perception of communism requiring a preliminary stage of advanced capitalism, in line with the celebrated principle in the preface to Capital, whereby the natural laws of capitalist production entail tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results, such that the country which is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. In a book on Engels, I elaborate Marx's opinion that there could be no transition to communist organization based directly on the rural commune. I don't believe that Marx put much confidence in the notion of a rural commune as being the source, a possible source of a communist regime. I won't say more about the developments within advanced capitalism. I turn to the acquisition of proletarian control. By a communist revolution, Marx referred specifically to the acquisition and maintenance of political power by the proletariat. Thus, he avers in the Critique of the Gotha Programme, 1875, that between the capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other, corresponding to which there is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. The term revolution, it may seem, might legitimately be retained, since there is no conflict with those evolutionary processes occurring within capitalism. On the contrary, the communist takeover must occur only when the time is right. But the following considerations relating to the character of the so-called revolution itself require attention. Recall that the Communist Manifesto closes with a declaration that the Communists openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. This is misleading, since from the 1840s, Marx and also Engels had recognized the potential of constitutional reform enhancing proletarian political power. In the principles of communism, upon which the Communist Manifesto was based, Engels had recognized the possibility of achieving political control by constitutional means, while the Communist Manifesto itself described the impact of modern industrial development on the proletariat, whose quantitative expansion and coherence are reflected in unionization, extending increasingly to the national level, and the establishment of a workers' party. Communist Manifesto expresses hostility towards a variety of critical utopian socialists of the day for violently opposing all political action on the part of the working class. And it supports constitutional reform measures proposed by the Chartists in England, the agrarian reformers in America, and the Social Democrats in France. Support for the Chartists is found in The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847, and particularly significant as a sort of retrospective evaluation after the failed revolutionary attempts of 1848 on the continent is a paper by Marx entitled The Chartists of 1852, which perceives universal suffrage as synonymous with proletarian political power. The carrying of universal suffrage in England, he writes, would be a far more socialistic measure than anything which has been honoured with that name on the continent. Its inevitable result here in Britain is the political supremacy of the working class. Needless to say, the achievement of universal suffrage should be seen as part of the evolutionary process, the capitalist state being obliged to offer such a concession from fear of its own creation, the proletariat. Recognition dating back to the 1840s of the possibility of a peaceful transition to the proletarian dictatorship throws into question Bober's focus on the early 1860s as marking a distinct shift away from force as sine qua non. And Stedman Jones implicitly sides with Bober when he refers to the 1840s and early 1850s manifesting Marx's belittlement of the significance of manhood suffrage and the democratic republic, his hostility indeed towards political democracy and universal suffrage. But if that is the case, what becomes of the potentiality of constitutional reform measures that I have cited from the Communist Manifesto with respect to Britain, America, and France, and from the Chartists of 1852 referring specifically to Britain? Are they to be simply dismissed? I suggest that the apparent contrast reflects Marx's opposition to universal suffrage as a strictly liberal principle of one man, one vote, but approval, provided the inevitable result would indeed be, could be assured to be, the political supremacy of the working class, namely a communist dictatorship. As I shall presently confirm, neither Marx nor Engels would have countenanced a democratic system that allowed the replacement of a proletarian majority, or worse still, a situation where so-called proletarians opted for bourgeois policies. When we move forward to the violent events in France of 1870, we find Marx in the Civil War in France, anonymously published, criticizing the Commune for inadequate ruthfulness, complaining, for example, that reprisals had at one stage been merely an empty threat. Isaiah Berlin must have been attracted, or must have been indeed attracted by this kind of a radical statement. And if we left the matter there, we might perhaps better understand Marx's reputation as the red terrorist doctor. But the matter is not so simple. In our own day, I dare say, we have become only too accustomed to the usage of the term terrorist to describe any opposition to the forces of law and order, however morally justified. And in the present instance, allowance must surely be made for the vicious conduct of the opposing government forces working hand in hand with the Prussians, which to my mind largely justifies Marx's reading of the communards as acting defensively. As for matters of principle, Marx goes on to admit candidly that the working class, I quote him, cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and yield it for its own purposes. The evolutionary processes, in other words, could not be bypassed. This is what he writes: the working class did not expect miracles from the commune. They had no ready-made utopias to introduce par décret du peuple. They know that in order to work out their own emancipation, and along with it that higher form to which present society is irresistibly tending by its own economic agencies, they will have to pass through long struggles, through a series of historical processes transforming circumstances and men. On various occasions in the early 1870s, Marx distinguishes between countries with respect to violent revolution. All depended on the ruling circumstances. An interview accorded the World newspaper only a few weeks after composition of the civil war in France conveys the point in question. In England, insurrection would be madness, where peaceful agitation would more swiftly and surely do the work. Now, this perspective on the English case is represented by Stedman Jones as a revised position, whereas I have documented earlier indications of the same orientation. As for France, Marx opines in the interview that 100 laws of repression and a mortal antagonism between classes seem to necessitate the violent solution of social war, contrasting with the civil war in France. But one notes that Marx is expressing himself tentatively. He is not sure about the future. Needless to say, to allow, as he does, that in most continental countries, force must be the lever of our revolution, conflicts radically with the evolutionary principle laid down in the preface to Capital, whereby the country which is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. Now, a word is in order here regarding a circular letter of September 1879 sent to leaders of the Social Democratic Party by Engels, but also signed by Marx, lambasting Eduard Bernstein, one of a trio of Zurich journalists, proposing a new party newspaper which would be opposed to political radicalism and would adopt a line that is socialist in principle. This, the letter charges, is too moderate. And the Zurich trio culpably applauded, according to the letter, the party for showing that it does not wish to pursue the path of forcible, bloody revolution, but rather to tread the path of legality, i.e. of reform. But we must be cautious. Engels and Marx were not by this engaging in a call to arms and revolution, for they admitted that social democratic voters have sense enough not to break their heads against a wall and attempt a bloody revolution with the odds of 1 to 10, but insisted only that all options should be left open and that social democrats not deny themselves all chance of exploiting some violent upheaval abroad, a sudden wave of revolutionary fervor engendered thereby. In fact, a very mild alternative is proposed. They merely proposed, the letter merely proposed not revolutionary activity in a literal sense, but participation in polemic, that is, in resolute political opposition, laying stress on ambitious goals which are calculated to frighten off the bourgeoisie and attainable anyway in our own generation, rather than have the party devote all its strengths and energies to those petty bourgeois stopgap reforms which provide new props for the old social order and which might perhaps transform the ultimate catastrophe into a gradual, piecemeal, and as far as possible, peaceable process of dissolution. Note that there is no positive rejection here of petty bourgeois stopgap reforms, notwithstanding the inherent danger, only the importance of supplementing such steps by polemic to frighten off the bourgeoisie. That is what I have to say regarding the second stage of my argument with respect to the acquisition of proletarian control. And I come to my third stage, which is the first stage of communism. This is the third consideration of the extension of the evolutionary dimension beyond the acquisition of proletarian control of the state. Now, needless to say, the state itself, necessarily a repressive set of institutions as the term dictatorship implies, is a capitalist residue which Marx affirmed in the Civil War in France would ultimately have to be destroyed, or as Engels never tired of insisting, would die out naturally in the course of time. But beyond this general consideration, there are several more specific instances of capitalist residue. Firstly, in an initial phase, after acquisition of proletarian control, a capitalist sector is to be retained, and this for an unspecified period. As expressed in the Communist Manifesto, while the immediate end of the revolution was to seize the state, the proletariat centralizing all instruments of production as well as credit and the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Nevertheless, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie. The same caution is implied by the function here recorded the revolutionary dictatorship in extending, that's the word that is used, factories and instruments of production owned by the state. A gradual dismantling of the private property system is a conspicuous feature of Engels' principles of communism. Now, it would, of course, entail fine judgment to specify the rate at which the capitalist sectors might be safely dismantled by the communist regime, with reliance implicitly placed on the ability of the new administration not to compromise the performance by what remained of traditional sectors in creating or maintaining the capacity required to assure the successful implementation of a communist program. I'd like to state an aside here, which I think is an important aside, but which I can't develop at any length, namely, take note of Marx's recognition, even whilst he composed Capital, of complex decision-making by the owner-entrepreneur regarding innovation in the face of uncertainty. Briefly stated, once Marx perceived that the traditional functioning capital was being superseded by new corporate forms of business organization, he felt able to give him a send-off which recognized the pervasiveness of uncertainty in the application of new technologies, a very much more positive view of the operation of the functioning capitalist. Regrettably, he didn't seek empirical evidence of the technological potential of joint stock compared with private ownership of capital in the context that I now am concerned with, where he is recommending that the capitalist sectors be retained for a period after the communist takeover. The question is, which sectors would the new leadership, the new government, be concerned to retain? So there would be, in the first stage of the communist regime, the retention of some capitalist firms. Secondly, there is an affirmation by Engels that his own and Marx's support for cooperatives applied only to a transitional arrangement, which implies that even competing cooperatives would have been acceptable in the first stage, along with a capitalist sector, since centrally controlled cooperation was an important part of the permanent common plan, as Marx insisted in the Civil War in France. So they would be permitted to operate competing cooperatives. Thirdly, the initial stage of communism would entail wage inequality, reflecting differential physical and mental abilities. Marx, in the Critique of the Gotha Program, vividly explaining that we are dealing here with a communist society not as it has developed on its own foundation, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Only in some utopian phase would the principle from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs apply. By contrast, his labor certificate scheme, a prime feature of his proposed centrally organized system, recognized natural differentials between individuals with regard to talent. This is what he writes. One man is superior to another physically or mentally, and so supplies more labor in the same time, or can work for a longer time. And labor to serve as a measure must be defined by its duration or intensity. It is therefore a right of inequality. Striking indeed is the fact that Marx's position has a precise counterpart in Mill's argument against schemes entailing wage equality, notwithstanding differential talent. The nominal equality of labor would be so great a real inequality that justice would revolt against its being enforced. Of this common Mill-Marx position, Friedrich Hayek had no inkling when in Constitution of Liberty he insisted that from the fact that people are very different, it follows that if we treat them equally, the result must be inequality in their actual position, and that the only way to place them in an equal position would be to treat them differentially. It's beyond me that Hayek had no knowledge of his predecessors in that regard. Finally, there is the matter of compensation for expropriated property. Joseph Persky, in his fine book on Mill, talks of Mill advocating compensation rather than confiscation in his land reform program, implying that such a recommendation would be completely foreign to Marx. Yet Engels later recalled in 1894 that we by no means consider compensation as impermissible. Marx told me in how many times that in his opinion we would get off cheapest if we could buy out the whole lot of them, and whether this expropriation is to be compensated for or not will to a great extent depend not upon us but the circumstances under which we obtain power. So much then for my 3 stages and an illustration of the evolutionary theme, an elaboration of the evolutionary theme, the stage of advanced capitalism, the communist revolution, and then the first stage of communism. I want to turn next to Marx as laissez-faire conservative. The economic dimension. Now, Marx's evolutionary perspective implies in and of itself that reformist intervention threatens the development process and thus the transition from capitalism to communism. The Communist Manifesto refers to conservative or bourgeois socialism, alluding to a part of the bourgeoisie which is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. In a variety of the theme appearing in the class struggles in France, 1850, Marx opposed reformist measures designed to forcibly stem the growth of capital, that is, to prevent the evolution of the system. As Mises put the matter, Marx regarded reform measures as not progressive but reactionary. But we need not turn to Mises, since Engels himself admitted a conservative side to the evolutionary process, recognizing that definite stages of cognition in society are justified for their time and circumstances. In these terms, Engels in 1850 had condemned the 10 hours bill as reactionary. Marx was famously to revise his view when it came to factory legislation. This matter I shall touch on presently. But the case for regarding Marx as laissez-faire economist extends beyond the fear of reform and improving living standards. Now, if there were time, I would point out here how John Stuart Mill's great concern was precisely to counter the likes of reactionaries such as Robert Lowe, who rather than endeavoring to discern what principles are applicable to a particular case, by analyzing its circumstances, believe themselves to be provided with a set of catchwords which they mistake for principles: free trade, freedom of contract, competition, demand and supply, the wages fund, individual interest, the desire of wealth, which supersede analysis and are applicable to every other sort of cases without the trouble of thought. There is too Mill's rich contribution to the market failure phenomenon. His understanding of consumer ignorance, indiscriminate benefit, free riding, and to the extended role of state intervention necessitated by progress, control of pollution, overcrowding, and the like. And there is his case for intervention to enhance distributive justice on the grounds that the labour market, as it operated in his day, yielded a morally defective outcome unless corrected for an unjust distribution of property, and the assurance by state intervention in education of enhanced equality of opportunity. Only with these corrections, and I'd like to emphasize particularly because so little appreciated in the literature, assuming full employment in the aggregate labour market, would the emerging wage structure approach an equitable solution. I say approach, having in mind that even this outcome for Mill falls short of the cooperative ideal, which was hopefully to provide a solution to labour's dependency on capital. Bear in mind this reformist view taken by Mill when we come to Marx. Marx I regard as a laissez-faire reasoner, and his laissez-faire reasoning is reinforced by his sophisticated appreciation of the operation of the free market pricing system, a matter not sufficiently appreciated by commentators such as Rothbard, who take for granted that Marx must necessarily have favoured intervention. In fact, Marx silently allied himself with contemporary conservative opponents of reformist state intervention, and also to some degree with Friedrich Hayek, by which I intend Hayek's formulations of high principle rather than his various interventionist allowances in practice. Consider first an application by Marx of price theoretical principles to income redistribution proposals, as by James Mill, entailing state confiscation of rent. The point in question for Marx is that confiscation would require in practice land valuation indexes, cadastre in French, whereas these could not be taken as settled once and for all because of continuous disturbances in technical and market conditions. As for technology, rent, he says, could not be the invariable index of the degree of fertility of the land, since every moment the modern application of chemistry is changing the nature of the soil, and the geological knowledge is just now, in our days, beginning to revolutionize all the old estimates of relative fertility. There were, for example, instances when rent proper is wiped out by the competition of new and more fertile soils, or when hitherto scarce improvements lose their value on becoming universal, owing to the development of agronomy, all applications of the scarcity principle. But beyond this, and even in the absence of changing technology, fertility is not so natural a quality as might be thought, but is closely bound up with the social relations of the time. A piece of land may be very fertile for corn growing, and yet the market price may induce the cultivators to turn it into an artificial pasture land and thus render it infertile. Again, the application of scarcity economics. In brief, the state lacked the changeable detailed knowledge required for the proposed reform, a more Austrian conclusion than which it would be difficult to imagine. By contrast, John Stuart Mill's Irish land reforms did propose the fixing of rents by state commissioners requiring a sort of cadastre of the sort Marx so much deprecated. I turn next to Marx's objection to egalitarian reforms on grounds of historical materialism, the principle that the pattern of distribution is the necessary outcome of the mode of production, rendering irrelevant unfairness or distributive justice. In these terms, Marx objected to the option of reform within capitalist arrangement to correct gross distributional defects as proposed by the 1875 Gotha program. Is not present-day distribution the only fair distribution on the basis of the present-day mode of production? And Marx denied Adolf Wagner's attribution to him in 1879 of the view that profit was a deduction from or robbery of the worker. More specifically, by ignoring the economic role of income inequality, a redistributive program implied the undermining of productive capacity and the very ability to produce a surplus, which incidentally was the standard 18th century response of those arguing against equality. I hesitate. We're back online, I see. So far was this argument carried that in manuscript notes of 1879, Marx protested that he was falsely represented as maintaining that profit was a deduction from or robbery of the worker, whereas in fact the capitalist is a necessary functionary of capitalist production who enforces the production of surplus value, thus first helping to create what is to be deducted from the laborer. Already in Poverty of Philosophy, Marx had insisted against Proudhon upon the necessity in a private property society of classes which profited and classes which decayed, the latter implying the so-called immiseration of labor as a condition for the development of productive forces and the generation of surplus. The celebrated proposal in the Communist Manifesto for a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, be it noted, relates to the weakening of remnants of capitalism after the communist takeover and is not part of a reformist redistributive program pertaining to the existing capitalist system. Well, so much for Marx as laissez-faire conservative. Now, I want to turn next to aspects of Marx's revisionism and implications for the implementation of a proletarian program. Consider Marx's affirmation in his inaugural address to the Working Men's International Association, the International, in 1864, that the expansion of the British cooperative movement 1848 to 64 was excellent in principle and useful in practice. This perhaps intimates potential for improvement in labor's condition, but it's qualified since cooperation, because kept within the narrow circle of the casual efforts of private workmen, was unable to arrest the growth in geometrical progression of monopoly, to free the masses, or even to perceptibly lighten the burden of their miseries. To have positive effects of this order, cooperative labor ought to be developed to national dimensions and consequently to be fostered by national means, whereas this extension would never be countenanced by the lords of land and the lords of capital, who will always use their political privileges for the defense and perpetuation of their economical monopolies. Now, never be countenanced, this is a surprising statement. Marx himself, in the same inaugural address, had retracted this sort of argument in relation to reactionary hostility towards factory legislation, referring to the immense physical, moral, and intellectual benefits, hence accruing to the factory operatives, which are now acknowledged on all sides and which prove the fallacy of middle-class predictions that any legal restriction of the hours of labor must sound the death knell of British industry, as if that had not been his own earlier contention. It was, in fact, he now writes, the first time that in broad daylight the political economy of the middle class has succumbed to the political economy of the working class, namely the blind rule of the supply and demand laws to social production controlled by social foresight. Capital itself refers to the physical and moral regeneration of the factory workers. Reformist legislation perceived as a feature of the evolutionary process entailing an increasingly powerful working class generated by the capitalist development process itself. Bear in mind also Marx's inclusion in the preface to Capital of social welfare legislation as one of his tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. That the factory magnates, especially after 1860, were becoming increasingly reconciled to the inevitable because of modern industrial development provides a new twist to the evolutionary processes at play in advanced capitalism and promises to undermine Marx's conservatism, his hostility to reform in a major way. A related index of Marx's revisionism is provided by a truly remarkable pronouncement in the posthumous third volume of Capital regarding technological unemployment, implying that the capitalist state would, under some conditions, actually take measures to check the rate of innovation for fear of the proletarian response. A development of productive forces which would diminish the absolute number of laborers, in other words, reduce the aggregate demand for labor, would cause a revolution, because it would put the bulk of the population out of the running. And recall also Marx's presumption that the state would intervene to control monopoly. Let us look now at the notion of absolute immiseration of labor, inducing proletarian dissatisfaction and enthusiasm for major institutional change. In the report of the General Council of the International of June 1865, Marx declared that unions could not reverse the general tendency of capitalist production to sink the average standard of wages. At best, the working class can retard the downward movement, but not change its directions. And in instructions drawn up in 1866 for the delegates of the General Council, he emphasized primarily the role of unions as a political training ground, and only secondarily as counteracting capitalist bargaining advantage. And shortly thereafter, Marx found that little had been accomplished regarding improved standards by purely national working class organizations, unions as well as cooperatives. The working class remains poor amid the increase of wealth, wretched amid the increase of luxuries, and material privation dwarfs their moral as well as their physical stature. Indeed, the principle whereby the country which is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. That is applied in capital to predict the lowering of wages in the United States to the normal European level. Yet, for all that, in the 1871 interview I mentioned earlier, Marx allowed at least the potential for real wage improvement as a result of international cooperation. Formerly, when a strike took place in one country, it was defeated by the importation of workmen from another. The international has nearly stopped all that. On that particular point, what I'm looking for is a point that Mill made. He praised the same statement or sort of statement that Marx made in a famous address, and Mill was aware that it was Marx, to that effect. In that address, Marx had warned, if the German working class allow the present war to lose its strictly defensive character and to degenerate into a war against the French people, victory or defeat will prove alike disastrous. And he opined that here, this is the point, the principles of the International are too widely spread and too firmly rooted amongst the German working class to apprehend such a sad consummation. And Mill says of this, there's not one word of the speech that ought not to be there. It could not have been done with fewer words. The point is that there's great, great confidence put in the international cooperation between working classes to counter the tendencies that would otherwise have been going on, and presumably this applies or might apply for the reduction in wages, the otherwise inevitable reduction in wages. As for improvements in welfare more generally, we find, as I mentioned in his 1879 letter regarding the Zurich trio, that he was not opposed to stopgap reforms. And I should add that in 1880, he approved French reforms extending to Monday holidays, minimum wages, non-discriminatory pay between the sexes, and employer contributions to insurance. As with British factory legislation, Marxist conservatism seems to be weakening. Now, the dilemma created for Marx, of course, is that improved conditions of work and pay threaten to compromise labor's readiness to adopt a truly proletarian stance. Now, recourse might always be made to the standard repass that any improvement is a secondary matter, so long as the wages system itself remains untouched. But this assurance does not efface his own doubts regarding contemporary proletarian class consciousness, which improvement in labor's condition could only aggravate. We counter this concern in discussion with Engels regarding the American Civil War, when he complained of the sheep-like attitude of the working men in Lancashire. of late, England has made more of an ass of itself than any other country, the working men by their servile Christian nature, the bourgeois and aristocrats by the enthusiasm they have shown for slavery in its most direct form. Dare I say, I hope no one is listening, that of late England has made more of an ass of itself with respect to the Brexit question than anything they may have done at the end of the 19th century. Anyway, the following year, again to Engels, Marx refers to what seems to be a bourgeois contagion affecting English workers. Class consciousness was also undermined by working class nationalism, manifested in hostility towards the Irish, which encouraged the worker to feel at one with the aristocrats and capitalists against a common enemy. And we have encountered Marx's disappointment with the servile Christian nature attributed to working men, which introduces the role of national character. His concern is expressed particularly clearly in the report of June 1865, complaining that while a well-trained, self-conscious, militant proletariat was essential to assure the pressures required for the demise of capitalism, British unions were not filling the bill. Trades unions work well as centres of resistance against the encroachment of capital. They fail partially from an injudicious use of their power. They fail generally from limiting themselves to a guerrilla war against the effects of the existing system, instead of simultaneously trying to change it, instead of using their organized forces as a lever for the final emancipation of the working class, that is to say, the ultimate abolition of the wages system. Indeed, at the London Conference of the International in 1871, Marx represented trade unions as an aristocratic minority. Now, to be especially noted is the fact that several of the expressions of concern with respect to the reliability of labour are found after the passage of Disraeli's 1867 Reform Act, which doubled the adult male electorate. The implications are grave. If we recall the affirmation in the Chartists of 1852 that I mentioned earlier on, that the inevitable result of universal suffrage would be the political supremacy of the working class, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, no less. Without explicitly saying so, Marx was now intimating that a working class parliamentary majority might be unwilling to implement a communist program, or even that a working class electorate might choose to replace the proletarian party at the polls, bringing to a dead halt the entire evolutionary process relied upon to assure the transition to communism. A paper of 1878 introduces a further limitation created by public opinion, namely that a proletarian parliamentary majority in Britain and America could, by lawful means, rid themselves of such laws and institutions as impeded their development, though they could only do so insofar as society had reached a sufficiently mature development. My own view, I haven't yet quite finished, but my own view is that the whole story is a tragic story. A play could be written of the tragedy of Marx, that what is holding things back is the proletariat itself. I'd like now finally, I have my eye on the watch, to say a few words regarding, speculative words, regarding Mill's perception of Marx. Mill was apparently unaware of the Communist Manifesto or Capital or any other of Mill's formal writings, though his correspondence shows him to have been familiar with individuals, organizations, and publications associated with Marx and Engels. But how might Mill have reacted to the view of Marx that has emerged from my lecture? What would he have said if he was attached to the Skype system? Now, in the system of logic, excuse me, I'm going to skip some of this material and turn to Mill's primary concern. Mill's primary concern, political concern of the day, was the reckless extremities and subversion engaged in by the revolutionary continentals in France, Germany, and Switzerland, who neglected the likely consequences of their proposals regarding the abolition of private property and transition to a collectivist system with little idea of the alternative to be established. The worst were the revolutionary socialist collectivists who proposed to substitute the new role for the old at a single stroke, Mill cautioning that to force unprepared populations into communist societies, even if a political revolution gave the power to make such an attempt, would end in disappointment. This reflects a distinction drawn earlier between the English representatives at the Hague meetings of the International, leaders of the labour movement, some of whom known personally to him. These focused properly on practical improvements in workers' welfare, appreciated the obstacles to be overcome, and felt little hatred towards the classes whose domination they sought to end. Contrasting with this reasonable position was that of the French, Belgians, Germans, and Swiss, who, under the apparent direction of some Russian theorists, imagined that all that was required was sweeping expropriation and the undermining of existing governments, wholly unconcerned with what would replace the going institutions. Had Mill been familiar with the civil war in France of 1871 and somehow realized that the anonymously written document was by Marx, and read it without due allowance for the dire and exceptional circumstances surrounding the commune, and had he neglected the moral drawn from the defeat by Marx that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and yield it for its own purposes, he would doubtless have included Marx amongst the irresponsible continental supporters of violent revolution. Again, had Mill noticed that Marx was corresponding secretary of the International for Germany and Russia at the time of the Hague Congress, he might have come to the same conclusion. But considering the allowance made by Marx for a peaceful acquisition of proletarian power in the leading industrial nations, it would have been an erroneous conclusion. My point is that Mill would surely have welcomed Marx's actual position if only he had been familiar with it. For to differentiate Marx from the revolutionary continentals makes excellent sense, considering his adherence to the principle, the Millian principle, that when it comes to prediction, all depends on the precise circumstances of the case, and also considering his evolutionism that I have demonstrated, including the maintenance in the first and only relevant stage of communism of a residual capitalist sector, competing cooperatives, luck inequality, and even compensation for expropriated property. Now, notwithstanding what I imagine would have been his favorable reception of Marx, understood in my fashion, there still remain conspicuous differences between the two. And in the paper, I point some of these out. I'll mention only two of them, since we've nearly reached the end. One relates to the trade union movement, was becoming, according to Mill, increasingly conscious of its moral obligation to forward the eradication of inequalities and social injustices. This even assuming capitalist organization, which is precisely the prospect feared by Marx and Engels. And secondly, and regarding constitutional matters, Mill sought to restrain any working class majority from misusing its newly accorded voting power in the 1860s, the Disraeli reforms. And he supported the general principle of universal suffrage, subject to a variety of safeguards, including protection of minorities and assurances against class ascendancy, the working class not accepted. Again, this is the reverse concern of that expressed by Marx and Engels. Now, my conclusion. I take note in conclusion of an elaboration by Joseph Persky in his fine new book on Mill, of the theme that political left liberal philosophers, he has in mind John Rawls, are not really attracted by Mill, despite his profound interest in worker cooperatives. These arguments by Mill leave modern radicals cold, and he seeks an answer And the answer one is given to understand is because Mill considered that the historical role of the system of industrial capital remained as yet unfulfilled, that private property in the form of industrial capital still had a historic role to play. I find this reasoning compelling. We need but recall an observation in Correspondence of 1870 that the feeling of security of possession and enjoyment could not, in the state of advancement mankind have yet reached, be had without private ownership. Essentially, Mill's concern was to avoid prematurely undermining the property institution. So it is scarcely surprising if modern radicals do not see him as a heroic figure. But this has been precisely my argument regarding Marx's evolutionist methodology, which rejects both transitions between economic systems until the appropriate condition had been assured and within systems. The question arises, therefore, how modern radicals will react if my case regarding Marx is found to hold water. My final point is this, that the Marx-Mill insistence on caution when considering transitional problems, which incidentally I can show to be wholly consistent with the positions of both Adam Smith and David Ricardo, is pertinent to modern concerns. Awareness of this tradition might have served as a red flag for our professional advisors and their clients who so recently rushed to dismantle control systems with inevitably disastrous outcomes. And I'm inclined to say to enthusiastic cliff-edge Brexiteers, you have been warned. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hollander, for addressing our participants. I thank you on behalf of all our participants and our organizers. Had you been here, we would have presented you with a small memento. However, we'll make sure that it reaches you. Dr. Sunita Lal will just give you a glimpse of the memento.
Thank you so much.
Thank you once again.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll share it. Now, Professor Ghosh would like to convey a brief message. Can we please have you on stage?
Friends, before I go for the valedictory session, I have a small and pleasant announcement to make. For the last 5 days, all of us have been here and enjoying the deliberations of the conference. But one of us stands out. He is Comrade Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi, who has been a member of the Communist Party for last. Comrade Vidyarthi is 94. You can imagine, and he has all the patience and eagerness and energy to stand with the whole of the conference. On the behalf of the organizing committee of the conference, we would like to present him the memento there. May I request Dr. Sunita Lal to make the presenter there. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now we'll have a short video with snippets of the conference. I think, are we ready with the video?
50th anniversary of Marx was organized. And at that time, all the top academics who were involved with Marxian discourse, they had converged in a place like Begusarai, which was very remote. It was a sub-divisional town.
I'm sure we're going to share the video in some form later on with everyone. We've almost come to the end of the 5-day conference on Karl Marx, organized by Asian Development Research Institute, ADRI. I request Lord Meghnad Desai, Chairman Academic Advisory Committee of the conference, to give a summary of the conference to us. I request Dr. Marcelo Musto and Neeraj Kumar, Convener Academic Advisory Committee of the conference and Managing Editor, Center for Economic Policy and Public Finance, also to join us on stage.
Are we all here? Thank you, Satika, not just for this, but for telling us through the whole conference to behave ourselves, announcing each program and reading out the biographies, both of the people being honored in the title of the lectures and the people giving the lectures as well. Thank you very much. You've shown... Okay, I mean, this is like an orgy. You know, one can imagine orgies of food and orgies of drink. This is an orgy of talk, an orgy of intelligent talk, done in a very friendly manner among people who probably don't agree on anything else at all. But they have been very patient with each other and really gone into some serious, real depth at certain levels. Documents have been cited. Different editions, corrections, footnotes of Karl Marx and Engels' work have been cited, and we have covered the whole world. Let's also say, let me also say that this is one of the few conferences I have been at in my life where people from every continent have been represented here. I counted the total number of lectures, 55 different items. Not all 55 are here because we had 2 or 3 on Skype, but we have had 55 presentations from 18, people from 18 different countries have been here. And those 18 countries cover all the continents. And I've never ever been at a conference like this. So thank you all for coming from far away. And whatever else one can say about the English language, it is at least universally known. And that is an advantage. So thank you all very much. I must particularly notice that we have really, I certainly have gained very much from listening to the younger scholars. Very many of them had only short presentations. They did not have a full lecture to themselves, but they managed in that short lectures to show us that there is a lot of very exciting work going on, which we will all have to get into our heads and learn how things are progressing in a variety of directions that the results of this young presenter showed. And it's also very interesting, and this is what I can say from my perspective. When you're young, you always prepare too much and you have too little time. So you have to speak very, very fast. But that is not their problem. That's our problem. We have to keep up with what they are saying because it's very hard to understand otherwise. But it was very enjoyable. Very enjoyable that we had a variety of perspectives from people. We did not very well on the gender balance, but not too badly. I think I count the ratio as 30% women, 70% men, which I think we ought to do better, maybe for the 300th anniversary, where we won't be here. But we ought to do better on that than that. Now, one of the great things has been the diversity, both of the topics and of the treatment. On the last day alone, we have had, at least in my count, 4 or 5 presentations on the future communist society according to Marx. And there were different sort of perspectives presented to us. But even in the last one that Sam Hollander put forward, there was some discussion about what Marx thought about how, when the future would come, or what the future would look like, or what to do, and so on. Now, when I go back to the thing before that, there was Chun Lin, who talked about, not about just Marx and Asia, but how Asia was going to be the future revolutionary theater for change. And then as I go back further up, Boyo talked about dystopias, and then at one further remove, Professor Kao talked about the future post-capitalist society from his perspective, which was very different from the perspective that Peter Houdin was talking about. So we had 4 or 5 very different perspectives, and that is the great joy of this conference. We don't agree. Thank God we don't agree. It would be very dull indeed if we did agree. And so I certainly feel that to have people of different generations, people of different nationalities, and people who come from different traditions of Marxism is a great gain for this conference. I'm not going to take up much more of your time. Another thing I should note, which may be a theme which may come out of this thing for future research, and that was that we had, for me definitely, a rare pleasure of a number of people coming from the USA who were presenting the perspective of black Americans and the themes which the Black America is discussing, especially the theme of racial capitalism. And it's something that we ought to think about, whether over and above the pure model of the proletariat and use value and exchange value and surplus value, whether there are extra dimensions of exploitation which don't have strict economic logic, but they have a political logic of discrimination, of bias, and so on, both regarding women's work and Dalits in India, other obstacles to put to other minorities in India, like Muslims or people who don't speak the same language in a region. I think that that theme of whether we have to add to the corpus of the classical Marx theory these new political dimensions, does it make a lot of difference that in India, at least universal adult franchise, the right to vote is very safe for all communities, regardless of their status, whereas in the United States, there is a constant struggle for many black Americans to be able to vote in each election because there are always people trying to deprive them of their right to vote under some or other peculiar condition. Now this is, and so the character of democracy also affects the nature of exploitation. And I think we ought to take up that as a theme. What else do I have? No, I think I'm liable to talk too much. So I'm going to stop here. Let me say, before I conclude, that really I have been inveigled into this idea, seduced into this thing by Shaibal Gupta, who is obviously the real person, the real spirit behind this conference, and we owe him a great vote of confidence. And what is more, tomorrow is his birthday. And so we congratulate, we wish him the best for his birthday. It's not often you can be 21 again, but you won't be 21 again, but it's good that you have a 21st birthday tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much, and I have now asked my fellow panelists to do their piece. Neeraj. Now, yes, Neeraj is the sort of Superman of the conference, because whenever you have any doubt, you go to Neeraj and your problems get solved. So, Neeraj. Sure. No, he's going to go to that properly. He's got discipline, not like me. No. Let him speak. Let him speak. Why don't you ignore them? Speak.
I go first. I think
What's going on? This is class discrimination.
Well, it's Gupta was directing us. Anyway, I will take just 2 minutes of your time, but I wanted to express truly the sincere gratitude to all of you on behalf of the international delegation and to all the professors and the guests who came here to Patna, some of us for the first time. I also wanted to say some words in particular to Professor Shaibal Gupta, but you have done it so well, Professor Desai, that I don't have to add very much about this. But I want to say that in very, very few cases in all my academic life, I've been treated with so much attention and care, starting from the email, starting from the way the coordinators interacted with us in the past months when we built this organization, when we built the conference, and since the very first moment that we arrived here, when we received these beautiful bags that you prepared for us, so special, or the special gift with the image of Karl Marx and the quotation from the 11th thesis of the thesis on Feuerbach. I wanted to congratulate with the organization, because to have this kind of conference, as you said, with the numbers that you mentioned, more than 38 special lectures, so many panels, roundtables, more than 50 scholars who came here, most of them international from all the countries that you mentioned, is really a question of how you were able to organize this. It would have been already difficult to organize. It has been already difficult to organize this in Berlin or in Beijing, to mention just two of the perhaps biggest conference that took place this year for Marx Bicentenary. But to bring all these people with this quality and with this diversity of interpretation to Patna has been a very special accomplishment that you have done. Also, for some of us, this has been a special experience, because in my case, I've never been to a conference which was 5 days long. I knew that you in India have long movies of 3-4 hours. Now I learned that you also have long conferences of 4 or 5 days. So I wanted to thank you for this. For me, it has been also a pleasure to meet so many young scholars in this institute. I also wanted to say this because it is very rare that you go to an institute and you find so many young people, so prepared, so kind, and also who have strong position inside the institute with responsibilities, not doing secondary jobs and something like this. It is something that was also special for me. And at the same time, I want to say that I've never seen an organization, an institute, that for this kind of conference took the risk that you took, the risk of inviting many young scholars. Because perhaps sometimes also myself, also many of us who organize here, we always look for the stars, the names, the big professor, which is what you have done, what you accomplished to do, because we had so many prestigious professors here. But you were so wise to invite many young scholars and very young professors that perhaps will not have did not call the attention that all the other stars did. But with this invitation, I believe that you guaranteed in the next decades, for the next decades, cooperation, gratitude for also young generation abroad. I believe that there is still very much to do, that we would like to continue cooperation with you, that it is important to establish project of cooperation with our university, with our institute, that we will try to publish the proceedings of this conference. I believe that this will be important. I don't know in how many volumes, because we have so many papers presented here, and that perhaps, as Professor Gupta was suggesting, that we try to open a center of study on Marxism. And this will be one possibility that we will try to work on in the coming months and years by getting funding. And I believe that with what you accomplish in these 5 days of conference, you already have a very prestigious international board that is very, very happy, that will be very happy and looking forward to working with you. Thank you very much.
Just to say that the only danger of having younger people is to be made to feel even more unintelligent than you are, because I always feel that they are so much better. And I just want to add one more thing before Neeraj says. For me, okay, sorry to single things out, but for me the one great experience was chairing Gayatri Spivak. I was frightened as hell as what will happen, but it was very enjoyable. And I have to also say that the last thing that we saw on Skype, to see Sam Hollander, you know, the man who's taken it so seriously, has written the whole thing out very carefully. He's an outstanding scholar, and you know, for him to have gone through that degree of care and attention, I was very impressed and very pleased. Anyway, Neeraj.
This is the most difficult job, in fact, but yet I am ready to do that. There is no protocol for me in all these things, and I may miss some of the names, but that doesn't mean that I'm not valuing you or you haven't been of any use to the conference. But first and foremost, I would like to thank Lord Desai, Dr. Shaival Gupta, and Professor Anjan Mukherjee, and Marcelo Musto. Yeah. Because you conceptualized the conference and you carried it through till the end. Thereafter, I am also thankful especially to Gopa Sarwal, who took time for us and gave 5 full days. I'm thankful to you, ma'am. Professor Ghosh and Dr. Sunita Lal have always been with us. No amount of word will be enough. We all have been going through the same phases of disappointments, happiness, and all these things. I will also say thanks to Sankarda, who is not here present with us today, but he wanted to come, but somehow he was not able to come. And I'm also thankful to Shri Sanjeev Kumarji and Professor Deepak Gyawali.
Yeah.
Though they are in our academic advisory committee. And of course, Ashwat Gautamji. Next, I would like to thank my special thanks to all the rapporteurs, because nobody was given any research paper or any sort of draft of all the research papers that were presented here, but they still reported on it and they still covered all the things, especially Kyungshuk, who came from Calcutta. And I'm thankful to Niladri, Barna, Bakshi, Soumya, Rahbar and Abhishek. You all were wonderful. Now coming to the logistics part, I think I can't name all of you because there are a lot of names. But before that, let me thank especially Setika, because you were absolutely wonderful. 5 full days of attention, and probably you gave much more time than me. I always arrived late in the hall. You always were here in the first person to be in the hall. And then I would like to take names, 3 special persons, those who have been the real stay behind the logistics teams. That is Suraj, Prakash and Suryakant. They all handled your travel. Prakash was always there with me, and Suryakantji always handled finance, everything. He never thought before spending a penny on anything. And now come my young fellows, those who are interns here in Adri, and Shrija, Suchitra, Aditi, Rishabh, Aman. You all also did a very wonderful job. 2 names that's my mistake, 2 names I forgot to carry in this brochure, because we all were in a hurry to prepare this and present it to the people. The names I forgot were from accounts department. I'm very sorry to them as well. That's Arjun and Bibhash. And the audio visual team, the recordings that happened over the last 5 days. Abhinash, thank you wherever you are. And of course Pragya and Sugandh, you all helped Abhinash in preparing all these things. I think I also have to thank Hotel Moria staff, those who have been wonderful, all like always. We have been organizing conferences at your hotel, and I think we will keep organizing at your hotel again. And Paras Hospital, you must have seen a small girl who is a paramedic staff. There's Durga. Indeed. Thank you. Yeah. You always were there, and in fact, I also had an opportunity to check my blood sugar and BP. So thank you. And I think I have tried to cover all the names. If I missed somebody, I'm so sorry for that.
Thank you.
And thank you all the participants once again.
Thank you. Okay.
See you soon.
See you. 250th. 250th conference.
It was difficult to speak after you because you covered so well on the topics, but I tried to bring information and perspective. I thought it was good, the speech of the young, that was important.